The room was filled with polished shoes, delicate laughter, and the clink of fine glassware. Walls were lined with framed artwork, each piece spotlighted as if it held the soul of its creator. Guests whispered in admiration, but all eyes slowly drifted toward a woman standing quietly near the centerpiece canvas. She wasn't loud, she didn't demand attention, and yet, she had it. Her name was Alara. A child stood beside her. Tall for his age, proud, his hand resting on hers. The art bore her name, the room bore her grace. And somewhere across that crowded space, almost hidden in the corner, stood a man who once believed she would never belong in places like this. Adrien Castel. His jaw clenched. His eyes betrayed a storm he could no longer control. She saw him, met his gaze, and smiled, not out of revenge, but from a place far more powerful. A place built through struggle, through silence, through dignity that never needed to raise its voice. If you've ever believed in karma, second chances, or the power of quiet strength, then hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs it. Because what happened between them wasn't just a fall from grace. It wasn't a simple story of pride and punishment. It was a lesson written across years, carved into the quiet tears of a mother, the sleepless nights of rebuilding, and the tiny moments of kindness that stitched her life back together. Have you ever felt small in a room full of giants? Ever walked into a space where you knew you weren't welcome, but went anyway, because your hope was louder than your fear? Alara had, and the world watched her be torn down, publicly, cruelly, without hesitation. But what if life gave her a second chance, and made him watch? The ballroom glowed with chandeliers that seemed almost too proud of themselves, casting gold onto marble floors polished to perfection. Music floated through the air like perfume. Every detail had been curated for excess. This wasn't just an event, it was a performance of wealth. At the center of it all stood Adrien Castel, the name behind the towering Luminara Hotel, the man who had turned real estate into royalty. His smile was practiced. His voice carried the tone of someone used to being obeyed. To Adrien, the world had categories, the powerful and everyone else, and everyone in that room knew which one he thought he belonged to. Across the sea of sequins and designer suits stood Alara. She didn't belong, and she knew it the moment she walked in. Her dress was modest, ironed 3 times that morning. Her shoes told stories of long walks, not limousines. Her hand held tightly to her son's, the only familiar thing in a room full of strangers. She hadn't come to mingle. She had come with hope. Hope that maybe someone here could offer her work. That maybe one kind soul in a room like this would see what she could do with a pencil and a dream. But hope has a fragile voice, and that night, it was drowned. Adrien's voice cut through the music like glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, raising his glass. "It seems tonight's guest list has expanded. Even charity cases are welcome now." His eyes settled on Alara. "Shall we applaud?" It was laughter that hurt the most. Not his words, but the ripple of agreement. Smiles that turned sharp. Stares that turned cold. Kyle, her son, looked up at her, confused. The way children do when the world suddenly doesn't make sense. Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't flinch. She squeezed Kyle's hand, lowered her eyes, and walked toward the exit, her steps quiet, her dignity louder than any insult hurled her way. She didn't turn back, not even once. But inside, something shifted. Not rage, not hatred. Something quieter, stronger, a promise to herself, this moment will not define me. That night, back in their small, dimly lit apartment, Alara tucked Kyle into bed. His eyes still held the confusion of the evening, too young to fully grasp cruelty, but old enough to feel its sting. He held her hand as if afraid the world might take her too. "Mama," he whispered, "why did they laugh at you?" She paused. Her voice didn't crack. She wouldn't let it. "They weren't laughing at me," she said softly. "They were laughing at what they don't understand." Kale blinked up at her. "Will they always?" She brushed a strand of hair from his face, kissed his forehead. "No," she said. "One day, we'll walk into rooms like that not as strangers, but as people who belong." It was not a vow shouted in defiance. It was spoken gently, the way strong people promise things not to the world, but to themselves. She didn't curse the night. She didn't scream into her pillow or search for pity. She simply sat at the edge of her bed, opened her worn-out sketchbook, and began to draw. Lines, shapes, faces. Her hand steady. Her spirit cracked, but not broken. Outside, the world kept turning. Adrian would have forgotten her face by morning. But in the quiet corners of her heart, a plan was forming, not to destroy him, but to build something better for her child. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is not about returning the pain. It's about rising so far above it. They have no choice but to look up. And years later, when the spotlight returned, it would not belong to Adrian Castell. Not anymore. The ballroom wasn't just decorated, it was calculated. Every inch spoke of money, but not the quiet kind. This was the kind of wealth that demanded to be seen, envied, and feared. Crystal lights glowed like crowns overhead, reflecting off gold-rimmed glasses that never stayed empty. Laughter rose in waves, but none of it reached the eyes. This was Adrian Castell's world. And tonight, it wasn't just about opening a hotel. It was about reminding everyone who owned the city. He stood near the center of it all, surrounded by people whose smiles grew wider the closer they stood to him. Adrian didn't chase approval, he collected it. With a look, with a smirk, with silence. His suit was a perfect fit, stitched by hands flown in from Italy. His watch wasn't for telling time, it was for telling status. Everything he wore, everything he touched, existed to whisper one truth. He was untouchable. He greeted old money men with fake warmth and crushed younger entrepreneurs with polished charm. He could raise your reputation with a nod, or destroy it by sipping his drink and looking the other way. He liked that kind of power. Adrian believed there were two kinds of people, those who built empires and those who cleaned the floors inside them. He didn't hate the second kind. He simply didn't think they mattered. And in this room, this glittering tribute to himself, he was certain nothing could challenge that belief. But across the entrance, unnoticed by most, the doors opened again. They didn't open with grandeur. There was no dramatic arrival, no camera flashes, just a woman and a child, quietly stepping inside. She didn't belong, and not because she didn't try. Her dress was clean, but modest. Her heels, slightly worn. Her posture, though, it held something rare in this room. Something the wealthiest guests had long since sold for influence. Dignity. Alara stood just inside the doorway, holding her son Kael's hand. She looked around, not with awe but with purpose. She hadn't come to take pictures. She hadn't come to mingle or be seen. She had come because somehow an invitation had arrived, addressed to her. It had to be a mistake, but she came anyway, because maybe, just maybe, this could lead to work. Maybe someone would see what she could do. Maybe someone would listen. Kael squeezed her hand, eyes wide. "Are you sure we're supposed to be here, Mama?" Alara leaned down, brushed a wrinkle from his shirt, and whispered, "We're just going to look around, that's all. Then we'll go home." But Adrian had already noticed her, and Adrian Castell didn't ignore what didn't belong. Adrian's eyes locked onto her the way a predator notices movement. Not out of fear, but irritation. Who had let her in? He tilted his head slightly, then took a slow sip of champagne. The murmur of voices around him didn't fade, but his attention narrowed. Alara stood by the far column, half-shadowed by towering arrangements of orchids, quietly observing the space. Not desperate, not timid, just present. And to Adrian, that was enough to offend. He leaned toward a nearby guest, muttered something with a sly grin. The guest turned, saw her, then chuckled behind a raised hand. Adrian wasn't interested in removing her discreetly. He didn't believe in quiet corrections. He believed in spectacles. He raised his glass high, calling for silence with a simple gesture, and the room obeyed. "Friends," he began, the corners of his mouth curling upward, "tonight is a celebration, not just of this building, but a vision, of excellence, of exclusivity." Laughter sparkled politely. He paused, then, with deliberate slowness, turned his gaze toward the woman by the column. "It seems," he continued, "that in our generosity, we've opened the doors a little too wide tonight. Even the forgotten have found their way in." People followed his eyes. Alara froze. Adrian's voice lowered, just enough to draw people closer, make them listen harder. "Let's give a warm round of applause to the brave guest who wandered in off the street. It takes courage to walk among lions." The room laughed, not a full roar, but that cutting, performative laugh people give when they don't want to look out of place. Kyle looked up at his mother, confusion plain on his face. "Are they clapping for us?" he asked softly. Alara didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat tightened. But she held his hand tighter. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She simply lowered her gaze, nodded slightly as if to herself, and turned to walk away. Behind her the laughter faded, not from guilt, but because something about her walk unsettled them. It wasn't the walk of someone broken. It was the walk of someone who had made a decision. Kyle glanced back at the crowd. Did we do something wrong? He whispered. Alara knelt beside him in the hallway just beyond the door, her voice steady. No, she said. But they did. Have you ever been humiliated like Alara? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters. The walk home was longer than usual, not in distance, but in weight. Alara didn't say a word. She held Kyle's hand down the quiet street. The lights behind them still glowed with celebration, but out here the night was calm, honest. No one was watching. No one was judging. Kyle, too young to fully understand, knew enough to keep close. His tiny footsteps matched hers. Every few steps he glanced up, searching her face for clues. Did I make them angry? He finally asked. She stopped walking. Kneeling down, she placed both hands gently on his shoulders. You did nothing wrong, she said, her voice firm but soft. Never blame yourself for someone else's pride. Kyle tilted his head. Then why did they laugh at us? Alara hesitated. Her heart ached with the need to protect him from this world, but not by lying. Sometimes, she said, people forget what kindness looks like. They mistake it for weakness. He nodded, slowly. Children understand more than adults realize. As they reached the apartment building, Alara felt the sting of it all begin to settle. Not in the way pain usually does with tears or shouting, but with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't accept defeat, only waits for the next step. She tucked Kyle into bed, brushed her hand over his hair the way her mother once did. He was asleep before she reached the door, peaceful, unaware that the world had just tried to teach him shame. But Alara wouldn't let that lesson stick. She sat at the small table in the corner of their living room. It wobbled slightly when touched. The single light above her flickered once, then held steady. She reached for her sketchbook, flipped it open to a blank page. Her pencil moved slowly at first, a line, then another. She didn't sketch the ballroom. She didn't draw Adrian. She drew Kyle, eyes wide, hand reaching for hers. She captured the shape of his curiosity, the softness of his trust. And when the drawing was done, she stared at it, not as an artist, but as a mother, as a woman who had been publicly reduced to nothing, and yet still sat upright. She whispered the words to no one. One day, we'll walk into places like that, not as outsiders, but as people they'll never dare to forget. She didn't need applause. She needed that promise, to herself, to her son, to the quiet strength inside her that no insult could erase. Because what Adrian Castell never understood was that power isn't measured by how loudly you speak, but by how deeply you endure. Before there was struggle, there was color. Alara used to spend afternoons by the window of her childhood home, sketching the world in charcoal and oil. Her notebooks were filled with people, not idealized but real, faces lined with exhaustion, eyes that told stories. She believed her purpose was to paint life as it truly was, raw, imperfect, beautiful. She wanted to study art, not to be famous, but to tell the kind of truths that language sometimes failed to capture. But dreams have weight, and when her father fell ill, hers was the first to be set down. The medical bills came like waves, one after another, relentless. Her mother did what she could, but jobs were scarce and time was shorter. Alara left school before her second semester. She folded her sketchbooks, packed away her paints, and took a job at a local diner. What started as temporary became routine, and what was once sacrifice quietly hardened into survival. She told herself it was okay, that art could wait, that her father needed her now more than the world needed her work. But when he passed, the silence in their small apartment grew louder than any grief. There was no applause for sacrifice, only bills, only cold mornings and aching feet. And then, Kyle. She hadn't expected to raise a child alone. At first, the man who held her hand and kissed her forehead promised a life of stability. He spoke of building a future, of family. But promises are light until tested. When she told him she was pregnant, he vanished. No calls, no explanation, just absence. She stared at her reflection that night, the same face, now carrying more than just her own life. Fear tried to move in, but something stronger stood in its way. Resolve. "I can do this," she whispered to herself. And she did. Ilara's mornings started before the city stirred. She'd wake to silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that reminded her she didn't have the luxury of sleeping in. The alarm was unnecessary. Her body had learned the rhythm of survival. While the rest of the neighborhood slept behind drawn curtains, she would dress quietly in the dark, tying her apron at the waist, pulling her curls back into a bun that would never survive the lunch rush. She worked at a corner cafe that always smelled of burnt toast and reheated hope. The uniform never quite fit, and neither did the paycheck. But she showed up 6 days a week, because not showing up meant Kyle didn't eat. There were no lunch breaks, only glances at the clock. No gratitude, just more tables. The manager barked instructions he'd already given. Customers handed back change like they were doing her a favor. At the end of every shift, her feet screamed, but her eyes stayed dry. She returned home each evening with sore hands and a quiet smile, because the moment that mattered most wasn't the paycheck. It was the way Kyle ran to the door the second he heard her key turn. He didn't care how much she made. He didn't see the grease on her shirt or the exhaustion in her walk. He saw his mother, the one who made every small moment feel like safety. He'd chatter about his day as she peeled potatoes or reheated leftovers. His drawings would be spread across the table, wild, messy worlds full of color and dreams. And though she barely had time to draw anymore, she always paused to look at his. "They're getting better," she'd say, tapping the corner of his paper with a proud grin. "You think I'll be as good as you?" He once asked, eyes wide. "You'll be better," she said, without hesitation. Their apartment was small, a single bedroom, a kitchen that hummed when the fridge kicked in, and a window that overlooked nothing but brick. Still, it was theirs. It wasn't much, but it was warm. Not because of the heater, but because of the love stitched into every corner. Sometimes at night, when Kyle was asleep, Ilara would sit at the edge of his bed and watch him breathe. That simple rhythm, steady, calm, reminded her why she endured. He gave her more than reason. He gave her purpose. It was just past midnight when Ilara woke from a shallow sleep. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch around her, pressing against the walls. She slipped from the bed quietly, careful not to wake KL, and walked barefoot into the kitchen. The clock above the stove blinked, a minute too fast. The light flickered once before holding steady. She poured a glass of water, held it in both hands, and stared out the small window above the sink. Outside, the world felt distant, unreachable. But in this moment, she wasn't thinking about the people laughing in ballrooms, or the men in suits who never had to count their coins before buying milk. She was thinking about her son. He had fallen asleep beside a stack of library books, stories about astronauts and adventurers, pages worn from being read again and again. His little hand had been resting on the edge of the last page when she gently moved the book aside. He deserved more than frozen dinners and broken heaters, more than watching her work double shifts, more than empty promises and men who vanished when things got real. She sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, her back against the cool wall. She didn't cry. She was too tired for tears, but the weight in her chest refused to ease. Still holding the glass, she whispered into the quiet, "I don't know how yet, I don't even know when, but I will give you a better life." Her voice didn't shake. It was low, steady, a promise carved out of exhaustion and grit. Not for applause, not for recognition, for Kyle, for the child who had given her strength she didn't know she had, for the tiny heart that trusted her to lead the way even when the road was nothing but questions. She stood, stretched her back, and placed the empty glass in the sink. On her way back to bed, she paused at his doorway. He was asleep, his breathing soft, one hand still curled near his cheek. She leaned down, pressed her lips to his forehead, and whispered again, "One day, they'll see you. One day, they'll see me. Not as the ones who didn't belong, but as the ones they could never overlook again." She didn't need the world to open its arms. She would build the doors herself. The library wasn't large. It sat quietly at the edge of the neighborhood like an old friend, steady, reliable, unnoticed by most. The floors creaked, the air smelled faintly of paper and wood polish, and the overhead lights buzzed softly when the afternoon sun faded. Ilara came here on her days off, not for herself at first, but for Kyle. He loved stories, dragons, planets, forgotten civilizations. Books were his favorite kind of escape, and they cost nothing to borrow. That alone made the library a kind of sanctuary. She sat at the reading table by the window, her coat still buttoned halfway, watching Kyle turn pages with quiet wonder. The rest of the world faded when he read. His lips moved silently, eyebrows twitching at the good parts, shoulders tensing when things went wrong. While he read, she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a receipt, the back of it blank. She hadn't drawn in months, not properly, but something about the stillness in this place stirred something buried beneath the survival mode she lived in. She took a pencil from her coat pocket and began to sketch. Not a full drawing, just a figure, a face, a moment, a hand reaching for a door, a pair of tired eyes staring out a train window. Things she had seen, felt, remembered. She didn't even notice the man standing nearby until he gently cleared his throat. "Is that yours?" he asked, nodding toward the scrap of paper. She looked up, startled, and instinctively slid her hand over the sketch. "Just something small," she said quickly. He didn't pry, just smiled, warm and easy. "You have a gift," he said, before stepping back and returning to a nearby desk. She watched him walk away, unsure how to feel. Compliments made her nervous. They often came with expectations. But this one felt different. Not a performance, just an observation. The next week, she returned. Same table, same hour. Kyle dove into his books, and she found herself reaching for another scrap to draw on. The man was there again. He didn't interrupt, just nodded politely as he passed. Later, as she gathered her things, she noticed a slip of paper tucked under her bag. On it was written, "Don't hide your gift. The world needs more beauty. Lucien." The next time Alara came to the library, she found Lucien shelving books along the back wall. He didn't greet her with fanfare, just a smile, the kind that didn't ask for anything. Kyle ran straight for the adventure section, already comfortable in the space. Lucien approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Did you bring anything to draw on today?" he asked, gesturing to her coat pocket. She let out a small laugh. "You remembered?" "Hard to forget something honest," he replied. That afternoon, they spoke for the first time without time limits or awkward hesitations. Not about deep things, not yet. They talked about pencils, paper types, the way some lines feel like thoughts and others feel like breath. Lucien listened more than he spoke. He didn't try to impress her. He didn't ask questions that felt too close. He simply created space, the kind she hadn't realized she needed. As weeks passed, it became a rhythm. On her day off, Ilara and Kyle would spend hours at the library. Kyle reading, Ilara sketching, and Lucien nearby, sometimes shelving, sometimes reading, always present, always easy to talk to. She learned that he'd once studied literature, but never liked the idea of climbing ladders just to impress people who didn't read. "I prefer being where stories are actually used," he told her, "not where they're just traded like currency." She liked that. She liked him. Quietly, carefully. Lucien never once asked about her past. He didn't need to. He saw it in the curve of her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned rooms before she sat down, the way her hand hovered just a moment too long before signing her name on library slips. One afternoon, as she gathered her sketchbook and reached for Kyle's hand, Lucien walked up and gently held out a small gift, a wrapped bundle of pencils, each one sharpened and labeled by grade. "They're not expensive," he said quickly, "but they're good. I thought maybe your work deserved tools that wouldn't crumble halfway through a line." Ilara took the bundle slowly, unsure what to say. Gifts made her uneasy, but this one felt different, thoughtful, quiet, given with no expectation of return. "Thank you," she said. Two simple words, spoken slowly, but full. Lucien smiled. "Don't thank me. Just keep drawing. If you believe kindness changes lives, leave a heart in the comments and tag someone who's inspired you." Later that night, as Kale slept curled beneath his blanket, Ilara sat by the window with the new pencils in hand. She hesitated, then opened her sketchbook. The page was blank, but for once it didn't feel like a wall. She began to draw again, not because she needed the money, not to escape, but because something in her had started to wake up. She drew a hand reaching out, not desperate, but offering. She drew a smile, soft and unsure. She drew eyes that weren't asking for permission, only understanding. She was drawing hope, And it wasn't just a pencil and paper thing anymore. It was something deeper. Over the next few weeks, Lucien's presence became part of her landscape. He never flirted, never pressed. But she felt something steady in him, something safe, the kind of man who wasn't trying to save her, just trying to see her. That meant more than flowers or compliments ever could. One afternoon, Cale tugged her coat as they packed to leave. "Mama," he whispered, "do you think Mr. Lucien likes you?" Alara blinked. "Why would you ask that?" "Because when you talk to him," Kyle said with a grin, "your eyes look lighter." She smiled, but said nothing. They sat together at the reading table the following week. For the first time, Lucien watched her draw without pretending not to. She was sketching Kyle, the way his legs dangled as he read, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're remarkable," Lucien said, voice low. Alara didn't look up. "I'm trying to remember what it feels like to be." Lucien tilted his head. "You never stopped being. You just forgot for a while." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full, with something unnamed, something gently waiting. That evening, as they said goodbye, Lucien held the door open for her and Kyle. The air was cool, and a soft breeze played with the edge of her scarf. "Same time next week?" he asked. Alara nodded. As she walked home, Cale skipping a few steps ahead, she glanced at the pencil set in her bag and the sketchbook under her arm. And for the first time in a long time, the world didn't feel like it was pushing her under. It felt like it was letting her breathe. Adrian Castell was used to applause. Deals signed over steak dinners, headlines written with praise, rooms that silenced when he entered. For years, success had followed him like a shadow, silent, constant, unquestioned. So when the first deal slipped through his fingers, he barely noticed. It was a mid-tier investment, a renovation project in a smaller district. The client pulled out last minute, citing concerns about long-term returns. Adrian didn't flinch. He called it a one-off, a calculation error, someone else's fault. When it happened again, this time a luxury high-rise development frozen, due to sudden legal concerns. His voice tightened, but only slightly. He told his board the market was shifting, that adjustments were normal, that men like him didn't worry, they adapted. Behind closed doors, a few of his investors began asking questions. Quietly, politely. But Adrian didn't like questions, especially when they came from people who used to admire him without hesitation. He brushed them off. After all, he was Adrian Castell, and Adrian Castell didn't explain himself. But outside his office walls, the world was changing. One by one, familiar faces began to turn away, former partners who once hung on his every word, now slow to return calls. A supplier delayed a shipment. A bank rejected a request for favorable terms. His legal team flagged an inquiry from regulators, and he waved it off like a fly near his wine glass. He still threw parties, still made public appearances, still shook hands like he was the man who could rewrite gravity. But the rooms felt different now. Conversations grew shorter, smiles thinner. People nodded, but not with admiration anymore, with caution, and yet his pride remained intact. He doubled down, more deals, riskier plays. He told himself he just needed a single win to shut everyone up, to remind them who he was. But pride doesn't build bridges, it burns them. And slowly, one by one, his bridges were turning to ash. Across the city, Alara hung one of her paintings at a weekend art fair. It wasn't in a gallery yet, not officially, but the space was warm. Her name was written in neat lettering on a folding card beside the frame. A woman stopped in front of her canvas. She stared at it for a long time, then asked, "Did you paint this?" Alara nodded. "It's real," the woman said. "There's something in it that just feels honest." Alara didn't quite know what to say, so she offered a quiet, "Thank you." Her hand still trembled slightly after every sale, not from fear, but disbelief, that her work, her voice, could hold space in the world. Kyle was nearby, reading on a bench with his legs swinging. Lucien sat beside him, offering him a slice of orange. That afternoon, Alara sold 3 paintings, and Adrian lost another investor. Adrian stared at the email without blinking. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, a routine update, cloaked in professional language. But between the lines, it said what no one had dared say to his face. They were pulling out, permanently. The partner he'd mentored, who once toasted him as a kingmaker, had signed with a competitor. Adrian let the screen go dark and leaned back in his chair. The city's skyline stretched out beyond the glass, but today it didn't feel like it belonged to him. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old article, one that had once been framed on his wall, a feature on his rise, his ambition, his vision. The photo showed him smiling with certainty, hand extended, the headline calling him the man who builds the future. He stared at it for a long time, then tore it in half. By the time the third quarter closed, the silence had grown louder than the boardroom chatter. His name still opened doors, but fewer of them stayed open. A few sharp-eyed journalists began to dig into old contracts. Lawsuits whispered through legal circles. Former employees hinted at backroom deals, unethical cuts, betrayals masked as business. Adrian called it envy, bitterness, people trying to ride the shadow of his name to stay relevant. But the phone rang less. The texts slowed. The ones who used to praise him stopped returning messages altogether. His assistant, who'd stayed with him through 5 expansions, handed in her notice. "I need something more stable," she said softly, without meeting his eyes. The worst part wasn't the collapse. It was the quiet. He was used to being envied, even hated, but never ignored. Now, in meetings, people looked at him with careful smiles. Not impressed, not afraid, just cautious, the way you'd look at a man who used to have power, and now only had stories. Meanwhile, across the city, Alara's hands were stained with charcoal again. Not from exhaustion, from creation. Her art had found a home at a local gallery. Nothing grand, but respected. Her section was small, but visitors lingered longer than expected. A journalist included a quote from her in a write-up about emerging artists to watch. Kyle read it aloud twice at breakfast. Lucien framed the clipping and hung it in the hallway outside her apartment. She laughed when she saw it. "That's a little much, don't you think?" "Not at all," he said. "This is just the beginning." She didn't dare believe it fully, not yet. But she let the feeling sit in her chest a little longer this time. Each piece she sold wasn't just income. It was healing. It was proof that what she carried inside her, the quiet things, the wounds and dreams, had weight, meaning. Adrian sat alone in his penthouse, the city glittering beneath him like a world he could no longer reach. The lights didn't comfort him anymore. He poured himself a drink, but it didn't taste the same. Victory had a flavor, and this wasn't it. He checked his inbox. Nothing urgent, nothing personal, just reports, numbers, declines, warnings. For the first time in his life, Adrian Castell had no audience, and he didn't know who he was without one. He opened his social feed. Alara's name wasn't there, not yet, but her work was starting to circulate in small circles, the kind of buzz that starts in the corners of culture, quiet but persistent. He didn't notice. Not now. But fate doesn't need permission to shift weight. And slowly, quietly, the scales were beginning to tip. The first art fair was small, just a stretch of folding tables lined along a quiet street, banners hung with hand-painted signs, the faint sound of a guitarist strumming near the corner. Most people came for the food stalls, the pottery, the handmade jewelry. Alara stood behind her table with her sketchbook open, her palms pressed against its edges to keep them steady. 4 of her framed pieces rested on small easels. She had priced them modestly, more out of caution than confidence. She told herself she wouldn't be disappointed if no one stopped. But people did stop. A woman in her 40s leaned in close to one of the portraits, a drawing of a father holding his daughter's hand. The lines were simple, but the emotion was unmistakable. "You did this?" she asked. Alara nodded. The woman's eyes softened. "It feels like something I've lived, like I know them." For the first time in years, Alara felt a kind of validation that went deeper than polite courtesy. This wasn't someone clapping to fill silence. This was someone moved. By the end of the day, 2 of her pieces had sold. When the buyers walked away carrying them, Alara's chest tightened. Not with fear, with disbelief. Kyle jumped up and down beside her. "They love your work, Mama. They love it." She laughed, pulling him close. "Looks like they do." It wasn't just money. Though the folded bills in her pocket meant dinner would be more than scraps tonight. It was proof that her voice, silent for so long, still had power. Weeks turned into months. 1 fair became 3, then 5. Each time, she set her table with a little more confidence. Each time, Kyle arranged the frames neatly and greeted visitors with a polite, "Hello, this is my mom's art." Her pieces began to develop a reputation among fair regulars. People sought her out, not for grand landscapes or polished perfection, but for the quiet honesty of her portraits. Her drawings captured moments of tenderness, a child asleep in a parent's lap, two elderly, women laughing at a park bench, a weary man resting his head in his hands. Her work wasn't glamorous. It was human, and people hungered for that. Kyle would beam each time someone bought a piece. "Told you, Mama. They see what I see." Alara began to stand taller, not out of pride, but out of release. Years of invisibility slowly loosened their grip. At one fair, she adjusted a frame on the table. She noticed a man in a gray coat pause in front of her work. He didn't speak at first. He simply studied. His gaze lingered longer than most. Finally, he turned to her. "Do you have more pieces like these?" Alara hesitated. "At home, yes. These are just the ones I brought today." He extended a card. His name was Henri Moreau, gallery owner, not of the grand chandeliered halls like Adrian's, but of a respected mid-city gallery known for showcasing raw talent. "I think people should see more of what you can do," he said plainly. "Would you come by next week? Bring your work." Alara blinked, unsure whether to believe him. She took the card carefully, afraid it might disappear. "Yes," she managed. "I'll come." Kale tugged at her sleeve once the man walked away. "Mama, did you hear that? A gallery." Her lips parted, but no words came. She just pressed the card against her palm and let herself feel the possibility. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a door. The gallery wasn't grand. No fountains, no security guards, just white walls, soft lighting, and quiet that made you listen. Alara arrived with her portfolio tucked under her arm. She wore the same dress from her first art fair, cleaned, pressed, and paired with simple shoes. Kyle walked beside her, holding her hand with the same ease he had when they crossed busy streets. He didn't say much, but his smile said everything. Henri met her at the entrance. He didn't waste time with flattery or formalities. "Come," he said. "Let's see what you've brought." Inside his office, she laid her drawings out across the table. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed the pages. These were pieces she hadn't shown at the fairs, more intimate ones. A mother cradling a child. A woman waiting at a bus stop, lost in thought. A boy holding a broken toy, not crying, just thinking. Henri took his time. He didn't comment after the first one, or the second. He simply studied each image with the silence of someone used to watching carefully. When he finished, he sat down and folded his hands. "Do you know what I see?" he asked. Alara shook her head. "I see honesty, not polish, not perfection, something real, something rare." He tapped one of the drawings. "You don't draw to impress, you draw to remember." She didn't know what to say, so she didn't speak, just listened. "I'd like to offer you a wall," he said. She blinked. "A wall?" "In the next showcase. Small start, half a wall maybe. But if people respond, we grow from there." Alara's breath caught. Kyle leaned toward her. "Mama, say yes." She smiled, nodding once. "Yes, thank you." Henri returned the nod, but his voice stayed steady. "Don't thank me. You earned it." The gallery opening was modest but steady. Local artists, curious collectors, students with notepads, couples on date nights. Alara stood off to the side, not used to being looked at without judgment. Her work hung cleanly along the far wall. 5 pieces, all framed, all hers. She didn't hear applause or compliments shouted across the room, but she saw heads tilt, eyes linger, whispers shared between viewers. Kyle stayed close, introducing himself proudly as the artist's son to anyone who would listen. Lucien arrived near the end. He didn't say much, just took one long look at the drawings, then turned to her and said, "You didn't rise. You returned." Alara exhaled and smiled. Over the next few weeks, things changed. Slowly, yes, but meaningfully. Henri called to say one of her pieces had sold. Then another. Her name was mentioned in an article about local artists who capture the quiet parts of life. Someone offered to commission a piece, her first. For the first time, she didn't need to count bills at the grocery store. She bought Kyle a new backpack, paid off an old electricity bill, took a day off, not because she was sick, but because she could. Everywhere she went, she carried herself differently. Not louder, not prouder, just steadier. She was no longer proving anything. She was simply living. One night, after Kyle fell asleep with his drawings spread across the floor, Alara stood by the window, her arms folded, looking out into the quiet. Not up at the city lights, not down at the sidewalk, just straight ahead. There was no applause, no parade, just peace. That was enough. She didn't need the world to remember her name. She just needed her son to see her as strong. And he did. He always had. The woman who had once been publicly shamed was now quietly rising. No revenge. No spotlight stolen back. Just a mother, an artist, a woman with a voice the world had tried to silence, now speaking through every pencil stroke. And people were listening. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday. Heavy paper, smooth edges, gold seal. Alara almost threw it out. It looked like the kind of invitation meant for someone else. The kind that always felt like a reminder, not of opportunity, but of what she didn't have. She opened it slowly. The invitation was handwritten. You are cordially invited to the Autumn Artists and Patrons Charity Benefit. We are honored to include your work in this year's showcase. Formal attire requested. Please bring a guest. She read it twice, then a third time. She set it down and stared at it for a long moment, unsure what to feel. This wasn't a fair. It wasn't a pop-up market. This was a room she had once been laughed out of, a room with soft lights, and expensive shoes and people who judged you before you even spoke. Kyle peeked over her shoulder. Are you going? She nodded slowly. Yes. This time, I'm supposed to be there. The night of the benefit, she stood in front of the mirror wearing a dark blue gown loaned from the gallery's styling program. Simple, elegant. The neckline was modest. The fit, perfect. Lucien waited near the door, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked up as she stepped into the hallway and gave a slow nod. You look like someone who walks into the fire and never asks if she'll make it out, he said. She smiled softly. I used to just watch the fire from outside, and now, I am the fire. The hall was familiar, too familiar. Marble floors, chandeliers above, glasses clinking, murmurs drifting through velvet-curtained walls. It could have been the same room. Maybe it was. She didn't ask. She didn't need to know. She walked past servers offering champagne and guests in black ties, past names she'd once only heard whispered with reverence. She didn't shrink. She didn't puff up either. She just walked, head high, shoulders steady. Her section was toward the center. 5 of her newer works, more abstract this time, more daring. The lighting fell perfectly across them. Already, a small group was gathered in front. Lucien touched her hand gently. Go. I'll be right here. She nodded and stepped forward. A woman leaned closer to one of the pieces. This one, it feels like grief but not defeat. Alara replied softly. It's about surviving what no one saw. The woman turned, surprised. You're the artist? Alara nodded. Well, I hope you're not planning to stop anytime soon. From across the room, a figure watched. Still, hesitant, not fully part of the crowd. Adrien Castel. He was thinner now. His suit, still tailored, looked as though it hadn't been cleaned with care. His shoulders were tense. His hair no longer carried its signature shine. And his eyes, they no longer scanned the room for approval. They darted, as if he was waiting to be noticed, but dreading what that notice might bring. He saw her, and froze, not out of guilt, out of recognition, out of memory, out of the sudden, uncomfortable realization that she had changed, and he had not. Adrien didn't move at first. He stood just beyond the reach of the gallery lights, one hand around a half-finished glass, the other at his side, gripping the edge of his cuff like he needed something to anchor him. He hadn't planned to speak. Maybe he thought she wouldn't notice him, or worse, that she had forgotten him entirely. But when Alara turned, her eyes met his immediately, and in that instant he realized she hadn't forgotten. She had simply moved on. She walked toward him with slow, even steps, not to cause a scene, not to seek confrontation, but because there was nothing left to avoid. Adrien straightened as she approached, instinctively lifting his chin, the way he used to in meetings where he needed to reassert dominance. But Alara didn't flinch. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him, not past him, not around him, directly at him. Alara, he said, voice quiet. You're here. She tilted her head slightly. Yes, we've met before. Though back then, I wasn't someone you thought belonged in rooms like this. A few people nearby slowed their pace, sensing the air shift. Not a spectacle, just something real. Adrian's mouth opened, then closed. His usual words, the polished phrases, the charming deflections, weren't working. They felt useless here. I didn't mean to, he began. You did, she interrupted, calmly. You meant to humiliate me. You wanted people to laugh. He blinked. I was holding my son's hand, she continued, her voice steady. We weren't hurting anyone. But you decided that moment was yours to control. You decided our presence was a mistake that needed to be erased. A silence settled between them. It wasn't angry. It was heavier than that. I lost a lot that night, she said, but not as much as you've lost since. Adrian looked down. His voice, when it came, was softer. You're doing well. I am. And your son? He's watching me become the woman I promised him I would be. He looked up then, guilt flickering across his expression like a shadow trying to settle. I suppose I deserve all of this. Alara shook her head gently. What you deserve isn't mine to decide. I didn't come here for that. Then why did you come? Her answer came without hesitation, to stand where I was once pushed out and not flinch. The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They landed and stayed. She turned to leave, and for a moment he remained still. Alara, he called softly. She paused. He swallowed. I'm sorry. She nodded once. Then learn from it, she said. That's the only apology I'll accept. Have you ever run into someone who once hurt you, after you became stronger? Tell us in the comments how you handled it. Lucian stood at the edge of the gallery, watching her return with the same calm stride. He didn't ask what was said. He didn't need to. She reached for his hand, not as someone needing support, but as someone offering steadiness. The reversal hadn't needed shouting. It hadn't needed vengeance. Alara had walked through fire and emerged whole. That was justice enough. Later that night, Kael sat beside her on the couch, still in his dress shoes, his legs swinging off the edge. Was that man the one from before? He asked. Alara looked at him. Yes, she said. He looked different. He is, she replied. Kael nodded. You didn't yell at him. I didn't need to. He tilted his head. Because he already knew. She smiled. Because I already healed. The next morning, the gallery's social media posted a single photo, Alara, standing, beside her artwork, surrounded by light, framed by her own creation. The caption read, Some stories don't end. They evolve. The evening air wrapped around them as they stepped out of the gallery. City lights blinked in the distance. The street, lined with expensive cars and murmuring guests, faded behind them as they chose to walk rather than wait for a driver. Neither spoke at first. There was something comforting in the silence. Not awkward, just full, as though words would only clutter what had already been understood. Lucian glanced sideways. You handled that better than I would have. Alara gave a small breath of a smile. You weren't the one who had to live with the memory. No, but I saw how you stood there, how you didn't flinch. That took more strength than most people can hold without breaking. She kept her gaze ahead, watching the pavement under the glow of streetlights. I used to think revenge was about getting even, making someone feel what they made you feel. And now I think it's about refusing to be pulled down to where they left you. Lucian stopped walking. She did too. He turned to face her fully. You don't talk about it much. What happened that night? I didn't want it to define me, she said simply. If I kept replaying it, I'd always be reacting. Always trying to prove something. You proved everything tonight. Without saying much at all. Alara searched his eyes, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to someone who truly saw her, who didn't fill the silence with ego or noise. Lucian stepped closer. You didn't rise to hurt him. You rose to heal yourself. That's rare. She looked down, the warmth in his voice stirring something in her that felt almost too fragile to name. I didn't know how to be angry without staying angry, she admitted. And now? She met his eyes. Now I know peace isn't what happens when the world is quiet. It's what you carry when it's not. Lucian smiled, slow and sure. You've always carried more than you let on. They resumed walking. No rush, just two people moving forward, side by side. A few blocks down, they passed a small bench beneath a cluster of trees. Lucian motioned to it, and they sat. He leaned back, resting his arm along the bench rail. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you feel lighter after tonight?" She paused. "I feel settled, not triumphant." She shook her head. "Triumph wears off. But this feeling of standing tall without needing permission, that lasts." Lucian studied her face in the dim glow. "That's why I admire you." Alara gave a soft laugh. "You barely knew me when we met." "That's not true," he said gently. "I knew enough. Enough to see a woman who never let her pain make her cruel." Her laughter faded into a quiet smile. "And I knew," he added, "that if I stood close enough, maybe some of that quiet strength would rub off on me." "You don't need it to rub off," she said. "You already have it." He looked at her then, not with hunger, not with urgency, but with steady regard. "May I hold your hand?" She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because for the first time in years someone had asked, not taken. She offered her hand, palm up. Lucian took it with both of his, holding it gently. No claim, no pressure, just presence. Alara closed her eyes for a moment, not because she was tired, but because she felt safe, not loud, not on display, not approved of by others, just safe. Back home, Kyle waited on the couch, legs curled under him, a sketch pad resting on his lap. When he saw her enter, his face lit up. "You stayed late." "It was a long night," she said, kicking off her shoes. "Did he say anything?" Kyle asked. Alara paused. "He did." "Were you mad?" "No," she said. "I was ready." Kyle blinked. "Ready for what?" "To forgive. But not to forget. I didn't have to carry the weight anymore." He tilted his head, as if trying to wrap his young mind around something so complex. "But doesn't forgetting make it easier?" "Sometimes," she said. "But remembering, without letting it break you, that's where strength lives." Kale reached out and hugged her tightly. "You're strong, Mama." She held him close. "Not always, but I try." He looked up. "You seemed happy tonight." "I am." "Because people bought your paintings?" "No," she said softly. "Because I didn't have to shrink." The next morning, the apartment felt different. Not because the walls had changed, or the creaky floorboards had stopped their quiet complaints, but because she had changed. Alara stood at the small stove, flipping pancakes as Kyle set the table, his movements humming with joy. "Lucian's coming, right?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She nodded, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "He said he'd be here by 9. Kyle grinned. "I made a drawing for him." "What did you draw?" "Us," he said proudly. "You, me, and Lucian, walking in the park." Her heart warmed. "That's beautiful." The knock came as expected, gentle, not hurried. Kyle rushed to open the door. Lucian stepped in, holding a small paper bag. "Good morning. Brought fresh fruit from the market. Thought we'd need something sweet." Alara raised an eyebrow with a playful smirk. "Other than your compliments?" Lucian chuckled. "Those are always free." They shared breakfast around the small table that had once held more bills than food. Now it held laughter, a bowl of strawberries, and moments that didn't need to be earned. Kyle told Lucian about school, about his favorite teacher, about a class project where he got to paint something from real life. "I picked Mama," he said between bites, "because she's real and strong and pretty." Lucian raised his eyebrows. "Tough competition." "She's the best," Kyle affirmed. "Even when she's quiet, she's loud in the heart." Alara laughed gently. "Is that so?" Kyle nodded, then slipped away to retrieve his drawing, leaving the two adults in a rare pause of stillness. Lucian leaned back. "You've built something here. I hope you see that." "I'm starting to," she said. "For so long I was surviving. I didn't even know what building looked like." "You're not just surviving anymore." "No," she said. "I'm not." Lucian reached for his cup but didn't drink. "Can I tell you something?" Alara looked at him. "Yes. I don't need grand promises. I don't expect forever written in stone, but I want to keep showing up like this, not to fix anything, just to be here, with you." Her gaze didn't waver. "That means more than you know. I mean every word." She believed him, not because it was poetic or rehearsed, but because Lucian had always shown up. Without noise, without performance, just presence. They were interrupted by Kyle rushing back into the room, holding his drawing high like a flag of joy. "Here," he announced, handing it to Lucian. "See?" Lucien took the paper and stared at it with the reverence of someone holding a masterpiece. 3 figures, holding hands, smiling, no castles, no trophies, just warmth. "I'm framing this," Lucien said sincerely. "You've got talent." Kyle beamed. "Mama's the real artist." Lucien looked at her. "That's true, but I think you both have something rare." "What's that?" Kyle asked. "Heart," Lucien replied. "You live with it. You share it. You let people feel safe around it." Kyle leaned his head on his mother's arm. "That's because we have love." Alara looked between them. This man who asked for nothing but gave everything, and this child who had once clung to her in silence, now glowing with joy. This was it, the thing she'd longed for. Not recognition, not applause, but peace. A peace that didn't need to be earned, a love that didn't need to be chased, and a life that didn't revolve around survival anymore, but instead around belonging. Later that evening, when Lucien had gone and Kyle was reading quietly in bed, Alara stepped onto the small balcony. She looked out at the city, the same city that had once turned its back on her. It hadn't changed, but she had. She thought of the past, of all the closed doors, the quiet nights with an empty fridge, the sting of being dismissed. She remembered the ballroom, the laughter, the sharp words dressed as jokes, and she remembered how she had walked out of that room with her son, head held high, even when her heart broke. But now, her heart wasn't breaking. It was full. She had found a love that didn't demand she become smaller. She had found a place in the world that didn't require her to explain her worth, and in her son's smile, she saw the proof that she had kept her promise. They no longer needed to fight for space in someone else's world. They had built their own, one honest moment at a time. One sketch, one step, one act of grace after another. The limousine no longer waited for him outside. The driver who once stood stiffly at attention had taken a job elsewhere. Adrian walked now, not because he had to, not yet, but because silence felt less suffocating when it moved. The streets didn't greet him. People passed without glancing up. There was no pause in conversation when he entered a room. No one whispered his name anymore. He lived in a high-rise still, though not the one overlooking the city's skyline. This one faced the back of another building, gray, bland, quiet. The concierge rarely made eye contact. Inside his apartment, everything was clean. Too clean, like it hadn't been touched, like no one really lived there. Adrian sat on the edge of a leather armchair and stared at nothing. No headlines with his name. No calls from investors. No invitations. No one to dismiss. No one to impress. Just the memory of applause and the echo that followed when it stopped. He opened a bottle of water and wandered toward the bookshelf. Dust had gathered on books he never read. He pulled one out, flipped through it, and stopped at a random page. A line stared back at him. "Power doesn't protect you from consequences. It only delays their arrival." He closed the book. That line, he might have laughed at it once, called it naive. But tonight, it felt as sharp as any boardroom betrayal. He leaned against the wall and let the memories come. Not to romanticize the past, but to study the damage. He remembered the launch night, the ballroom, the toasts, the faces glowing under chandeliers. That moment when he saw her, Alara, and chose to use her as a joke. Why? Because it was easy. Because no one would challenge him. Because that's what he had always done. Remind others where they stood. He hadn't thought about her afterward. Not really. But she had remembered. And now, so did he. Not because of what he had done, but because of what she had become. Not loud, not cruel, not boastful. Just visible, respected, present, and in that presence she made him small, not by force but by contrast. He remembered her voice that night at the benefit. Calm, measured. "Yes, we've met before. Though back then I was someone you saw as less." No one had clapped. No one had gasped. But the silence afterward had said everything. It wasn't rage that humbled him. It was dignity. His phone buzzed. An email from a former colleague. A polite message declining a proposal. No offers of collaboration, just a courtesy. He deleted it. He wasn't angry. Not anymore. He was tired. Because arrogance was heavy. And now that he wasn't being fed praise, he had to carry it alone. And it weighed more than he expected. He poured himself a drink, sat down, and let the quiet spread. Not peaceful quiet, just the kind that lingers when no one is listening anymore. He thought of his empire. The buildings still stood. The logo still existed. But it wasn't his anymore. The people behind the scenes had moved on. His name was a shadow on the wall, one they might repaint soon enough. He had taught them to climb, but he had also taught them to push, and when it was his turn to fall, no one caught him. Not because they were cruel, because he had never built anything worth holding on to. Not people, not trust, not grace. He had only built height, and now he understood how lonely it was. At the top, especially when you've burned the steps on the way up. That night, Adrian sat at the long dining table alone. It could seat 10. Tonight, it seated 1. He ate slowly, more out of habit than hunger. The meal had been delivered, tasteless, perfect, sterile. Like everything he once valued. The knife scraped against the plate. He stopped. He could still hear Alara's voice. Not bitter, not raised, just sure. It wasn't her success that haunted him. It was her calm. How she didn't need to prove anything. How she didn't shrink. How she simply stood there, equal, maybe even more than equal. She hadn't asked for an apology. She hadn't gloated. She had just existed, powerfully, without needing his approval. That was what burned, not because she had won, because he had finally seen her. And in seeing her, he saw everything he had missed. Every person he'd dismissed. Every voice he'd silenced. Every chance at being more than admired, at being trusted, remembered, respected, lost. He walked over to the window. The lights of the city blinked back at him. Cars below moved with purpose. Conversations happened in rooms he'd never enter again. He had once stood above this city like a king, but a king who rules by fear builds walls, not loyalty. When the storms came, those walls didn't protect him. They buried him. He opened an old box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were clippings, news articles, photos from ribbon cuttings, awards with his name etched in gold. At the bottom, a photo, a rare one. It wasn't from a business gala or launch party. It was a quiet moment. Before the rise, before the gloss, before the detachment. He was smiling. A real smile, not the polished one. And beside him, a woman he had once loved. Before he chose ambition over connection, he stared at the photo. His hand trembled, not from age, but from knowing he had traded something real for something temporary. The next morning he stood in front of the mirror. The same suit, the same cufflinks, but the man had changed. His eyes weren't dull. They were just honest now. There was no audience, no cameras, just him. And that was enough, because at last he saw himself. Not as others did, not as he pretended, but fully, and it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like clarity. Days later, Adrian found himself walking past an art gallery. He hadn't meant to. It wasn't planned, but something caught his eye. A painting in the front window. It was a mother and child, walking away from a lavish party, hand in hand. The child looked up at her, not sad, but proud. The woman's back was straight, her face calm, her dress simple. Adrian stopped. His breath caught. It wasn't just art. It was that night, their night, but this time through her eyes. Not through humiliation, through resilience. The plaque below read, "The night they walked forward," by Alara Vale. He stepped back. He didn't enter. He didn't need to. The world had already turned, and she had painted the truth, not out of spite, but out of memory. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, thanked the silence, because in it, he had heard what applause could never tell him. And it was this: you can build towers, you can buy rooms, you can gather eyes, but none of it means anything if you forget how to see. And he had forgotten. Until now. That evening, Alara sat by her window, sipping tea, Kyle reading nearby. Lucien walked in, set down a small bouquet of sunflowers and kissed her on the cheek. She smiled, not because life was perfect, but because it was honest. Peace had come, not from revenge, not from fortune, but from walking forward with grace and never looking back in bitterness. Alara's journey whispers what many shout but rarely live. Pride may roar, but it is dignity that endures. Arrogance builds silence. Kindness builds legacy. Humiliation can spark transformation if we let it fuel growth instead of vengeance. Love, in its truest form, requires no riches, only presence. And karma? It doesn't shout, it waits, until the moment is right. Her story wasn't about triumph over others. It was about becoming whole, no matter who tried to break her. And in that, she won. Not with noise, but with stillness that made the world listen. She didn't scream when she left that ballroom. She didn't fight back or cause a scene. She held her son's hand and walked out, with the weight of the world in her chest and a promise stitched quietly into her soul. That promise wasn't about getting even. It was about becoming whole. And she kept it. Some wounds don't need revenge. They need purpose. That night of humiliation could have broken Alara. It could have closed her off forever. But instead of collapsing, she chose to bend without breaking. She didn't spend her days plotting how to get back at Adrian. She spent them getting better. For Kyle, for herself, for the version of her life she hadn't given up on, even when the world told her she didn't belong. Some people come out of hardship angry. Alara came out with clarity. She had known hunger. She had known rejection. She had known what it felt like to be invisible. But she never let those things define her. Her story is proof. Sometimes the softest voice carries the strongest echo. Power without character is empty. Adrian Castell didn't lose everything overnight. It was slow, quiet, not dramatic, just inevitable. His empire didn't explode. It emptied. One loyal partner stopped returning calls. One bad investment opened the door to another. One reputation shift made everyone else reconsider what they once admired. And when things finally collapsed, there wasn't a villain to blame. Only a man who'd never learned how to value people unless they could be used. What Alara taught us wasn't just about endurance. It was a mirror for every person who's mistaken influence for impact. The right people don't fix you. They remind you you were never broken. Lucien didn't give Alara a makeover. He didn't swoop in with a miracle. He just saw her. He looked at a tired mother in a quiet library and saw a soul worth listening to, a talent worth encouraging, a woman worth holding space for. And maybe that's what real love looks like. Not grand gestures, but steady presence. Not loud declarations, but a willingness to wait. He met her where she was and stayed close while she climbed. That's what Kale saw. That's what grew love that didn't depend on struggle, but survived it. Karma isn't loud. It just remembers. When Adrian walked into that second ballroom, months later, he didn't recognize the world around him. He was used to people standing up when he entered. This time, no one turned. He was used to being the center of attention. That night, he stood in the corner, watching someone he once ridiculed stand proud, surrounded by people who respected her. Karma didn't slap him. It simply showed him what could have been, if only he'd chosen dignity instead of ego. Alara didn't need to confront him with anger. Her presence was enough. The irony was never in the fall. It was in who rose while he wasn't looking. That vow she whispered to Kyle, after all the laughter and shame, was simple. One day we'll walk into places like that not as outsiders, but as people who belong. They did. But more than that, they walked in without needing to prove anything. Because Alara didn't chase validation, she earned respect. She turned pain into movement. She turned love into fuel. And when the time came to stand tall, she didn't shout her arrival. She simply showed up. For you watching, if someone has ever made you feel small, if you've walked into a room and questioned your worth, if you've left somewhere carrying shame that didn't belong to you, this story was for you. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't have to get even to rise. Sometimes the sweetest victory is showing up whole when they expected you to break. Start where you are. Stay close to what keeps your heart open. And remember, no one can erase you when you decide you belong. If Alara's story moved you, please subscribe. Share this story with someone who needs hope, and comment below with the lesson that stayed with you most. Let's remind the world that quiet strength isn't weakness, it's legacy.